Hello, my name is Hannah Morgan. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Sociology, and I've just taken over as the director of CEDA, which is the Centre for Disability Research, which has been established in the university for about 10 years but has now moved its home into sociology. So we're thinking about how we can engage with more people, get involved in broadly social science but other connections as well. So partly what I wanted to do is introduce you to the centre, let you know that we're here, that we're very interested in conversations. It's always my perspective on these things, but I can hear issues of disability and impairment in virtually every presentation we've talked about today. So I think there's a contribution and a discussion, and it was really helpful, I think, when Monica talked about developing a conversation, because I think there's a lot that disability studies can say to discussions of mobilities and vice versa. So we're a fairly small centre. One of the big things we do is a conference that's taking place in September, and if you're around and like to get involved with that, it'd be really good to have more interaction. And you can see quite how broad, although disability is quite focused in some ways, it opens up a conversation about a whole range of different issues. So for example, within the discipline, there's a lot of debate about how thinking about disability can open up what constitutes being the human and what that might be. So often it's a starting point for a discussion as much as it is thinking about the lived experiences of disabled people. So that's kind of an introduction to the centre, but also my interest in mobilities, which goes back a couple of years really, with two small projects that both raised issues of mobility that I hadn't been expecting in different ways. So looking at the mobility experiences and expectations of disabled academics as they sought to kind of develop careers and move around or not move often. And also looking at the experiences of people who use services, particularly those funded by the state, where increasingly people are expected to be moving, particularly in public spaces, and what that means. And I think what both of those threw up were issues about how disabled people experience different spaces and moving through different spaces. The literature around disability and mobility is very medicalised. If you do any sort of search, it's all about particular types of impairment or conditions, and often quite localised individual forms of mobility. A little bit of looking around transport, but in general the disciplines have remained quite separate. But I think something we've been trying to develop in disability really over the last 5 years is thinking about and understanding disabled people's experiences around sort of spatial, temporal and mobile movement and what that might mean. So how disableist and ableist practices influence people's mobility and their movement, but also how issues of impairment and constructed away from kind of very simple diagnostic or complex diagnostic labels to how things like impairment, fatigue, brain injury, continence that I'll come on to shape our ability to move and be mobile. So I think that's one of the things I've been particularly working on is thinking through how disability and impairment is embodied and in place, particularly by different forms of policy and legal narratives and exclusions. And often for disabled people it has been about segregation, about exclusion. Gosh, I'm really fast. And how kind of that interaction with policy. And I suppose the backdrop to all of that is the impact of austerity on disabled people, disability being cast as a very significant part of the global problem that needs to be responded to. So just really quickly, this is a picture from some work done by Liz Crowe. There's a very strong overlap between activism, and particularly art activism, and disability. And this was some work she was doing to highlight the impact of austerity on individual disabled people. So we're interested in how narratives of austerity are, again, restricting people's mobility, alongside a narrative that talks much more positively about disabled people moving. And then, very briefly, I'm developing quite... It's been quite an exciting project. It's not one I kind of anticipated when we started thinking about the experiences of disabled refugees, but builds on some work I've been doing around the impact of continence or incontinence for disabled people, and particularly thinking about how that's managed, and often not easy to manage in camps and in transition. So you might be familiar with the work that Amy Peake's done around trying to get sanitary products into camps, and that builds on work in India. It's quite a different type of project to work around issues of continence, so we're going to be working with NGOs and designers to try and develop prototypes that we can get into camps and then think about the impact of that. Thank you.